The steppe had gone silent beneath the snow, the kind of silence that didn't soothe, it smothered. The world had frozen solid by the time January 1943 came clawing across the front. The sky was an iron lid, sealing the land below, heavy with clouds that promised more misery. Every ridge, every tree, every corpse of a machine was buried beneath a white shroud that glared against the dim light of day. To the soldiers of the 3rd Guards Tank Brigade, the cold had become another enemy, more relentless than the Germans, more cruel than the shells. Men lost fingers in their sleep. Diesel froze in the lines. The T-34s, proud beasts of steel and defiance, became statues in the frost. Even the sound of life had vanished. No birds, no wind that didn't sting, just breath and silence and the crack of ice splitting underfoot. In that endless numbness, one man worked without stopping. His name was Mikhail Antonov, an engineer whose age didn't match the exhaustion in his face. He had the build of someone born for factory floors, broad hands, a spine that never quite straightened anymore, and eyes that saw details no one else cared to notice. He had arrived months before, quiet, almost invisible, one more cog in the machinery of survival. Nobody expected brilliance from him. Nobody even expected warmth. But Antonov refused to surrender to the stillness that had claimed everything. He worked in the hollow carcass of a tank stripped for parts, his tools spread across a tarp stiff with frost. Each breath came out white and vanished before it reached his chest again. Around him lay a graveyard of machines, frozen engines, broken treads, shells of hope that could no longer move. The men cursed him sometime, muttering that the cold was eating his mind. "Why waste time?" they'd say. "Nothing runs in this." But Antonov wasn't listening to them. He was listening to the tank, to the hiss of metal cooling, to the rattle of a wrench on a bolt that had been too long still. He knew the secret was in the fuel. Diesel that froze was death. Without it, the tanks were coffins. The Germans didn't need to fire a shot. The winter would do their work. So Antonov scavenged through scrap piles, ripped copper tubing from wrecked trucks, and stripped wiring bare with fingers that had turned the color of bone. The coil he built looked pathetic at first, a clumsy twist of copper around the fuel line, rerouted to catch a kiss of heat from the exhaust. It was rough, dangerous, and ugly, but it was alive. He sealed the joints with soot and frozen grease, his hands trembling so badly he could barely thread the fitting. When it was done, he stood back and stared at it like a man staring at a prayer he didn't believe in. When the captain came by, the experiment earned only laughter. "A stove," the officer said, shaking his head. "You think we'll win the war with plumbing?" The others joined in, the kind of laughter that comes from fear disguised as mockery. Antonov didn't respond. He had no energy left for pride. He just wiped his hands on a rag and waited for morning. That night, the snow thickened until the world turned into a blur of white noise. Men huddled inside the tanks for warmth, their bodies pressed together beneath stiff blankets, muttering to ghosts. Somewhere beyond the ridge, artillery thumped in the distance, muffled by the storm. The war still raged, though it felt impossibly far away. Then dawn came, bleak and merciless, and one by one the tanks failed to start. The men cursed and kicked at the frozen beasts, shouting at them as if anger could warm the metal. The fuel was thick, lifeless, like blood turned to ice. The brigade commander's voice cracked from shouting, echoing across the snow. But through that chaos, one sound broke the despair. The low, uneven cough of an engine trying to live. It sputtered once, twice, then caught. A rumble grew, deep and defiant. Black smoke curled against the sky. The men turned toward the sound and froze. Antonov's tank was moving. It was like watching resurrection. The engine didn't just start. It growled with a fury that cut through the cold. Steam burst from the vents. Treads chewed into the snow. And the steel monster rolled forward as if dragging the entire army with it. The captain who had mocked him stood there, his breath caught in his throat. No one said a word. The other crews climbed out of their dead machines and gathered around, their faces hollowed by disbelief. "How?" someone whispered. Antonov only shrugged. "Warm fuel flows," he said quietly. "Cold fuel dies." It wasn't a boast, just a truth, but the words stuck. Soldiers repeated them like a mantra as they worked to copy his coil, burning their hands on metal that finally remembered how to breathe. By noon, the entire camp was alive again. The air filled with the growl of awakening engines and the smell of diesel and smoke, and men who hadn't smiled in weeks began laughing through cracked lips. The sound of those tanks starting wasn't just mechanical, it was human, desperate, triumphant. The officers who had dismissed him now watched with something close to reverence. though none would ever admit it. Hope had returned, and it had come not from a general's orders or a hero's charge, but from a mechanic who refused to let the cold win. As night fell again, the snow glittered under the faint light of the moon. Antonov sat on the edge of his tank, staring at the steam rising from the exhaust, the copper coil glowing faintly from heat. Around him, the world was still a frozen graveyard, but he had carved out a small island of life within it. Somewhere far away, artillery flashed again. The war wasn't over, not even close. But now, for the first time in weeks, the T-34s could move. That night, the men said the cold seemed weaker. They swore the wind had lost its bite. Antonov didn't correct them. He simply looked toward the horizon, where the white snow met the black sky, and imagined what it would sound like when those engines met the German Panzers again. Somewhere inside him, he already knew. The coil they'd called useless would make history. Tell me where you're watching from. Just drop it in the comments. I like knowing how far stories like this can travel. By the second week of February, the coil wasn't just an idea anymore. It was doctrine. Every mechanic in the 3rd Guards Brigade knew the method by heart, and Antonov's design spread faster than rumor. Within days, it reached other units, carried by word of mouth and desperation. They called it Antonov's trick, half in jest, half in awe. What had started as a single copper coil now marked a shift in survival itself. The frost hadn't gone anywhere, but it no longer ruled them. The T-34s began to move again, crawling across the white plains like beasts thawed from ancient ice. And wherever they went, the Germans learned to fear the growl that rose out of the storm, because it meant the Red Army was still alive. The snow no longer brought stillness. It carried the hum of engines, the rattle of steel, the breath of men who refused to freeze. In the evenings, Antonov worked alone, checking lines, sealing cracks, whispering to his machines as if they could hear him. He wasn't chasing glory. He didn't think about medals or promotion. He thought about warmth, the kind that comes not from fire, but from movement, from proof that what you build can defy death itself. Sometimes, when the wind died, he could hear laughter again, the kind that sounded like men remembering they were still human. It was during those nights that word of him reached the front-line commanders. Reports filtered upward. An engineer whose tanks never froze, whose brigade could move while others stayed trapped. Commanders wanted to see it for themselves. They arrived in jeeps wrapped in white canvas, their boots crunching in the snow, eyes narrow and skeptical. Antonov stood before them, exhausted, oil-stained, unshaven, explaining the principle in clipped, practical sentences. One colonel frowned, rubbing his hands for warmth. "And you did this without authorization?" he asked. Antonov nodded. The colonel studied him a long moment, then said only, "Good, keep doing it." That was the highest praise he would ever receive. By dawn, orders were issued to replicate the modification across multiple regiments. Mechanics were given coils, instructions, and warnings not to burn their tanks alive. Some did, and a few engines caught fire, but those who succeeded found their machines unstoppable. For every 10 failures, one success was enough to change a battle. The Germans didn't understand at first. Their scouts reported Soviet armor moving through storms that should have stopped everything. They assumed it was madness, a suicide push through the cold. But when the first T-34s burst out of the snowdrifts and slammed into their flanks, the Wehrmacht realized madness could be a weapon. The Panzers, though armored and precise, choked in the frost. Their engines strained, their lubricants thickened, and their tracks locked. Yet the Soviets came anyway, engines roaring, armor crusted with ice but moving fast. At the heart of that movement was Antonov's coil, humming invisibly beneath the steel, turning exhaust into life. What had been born from scrap metal and sleepless nights now carried across entire fronts. Still, Antonov himself didn't change. He slept in the same dugout, ate the same watery soup, and ignored the sudden attention. The men respected him in their own way. They'd started calling him Father Fire, a name that made him laugh, though not for long. In war, laughter never lasted. He knew too well how quickly the cold could return, how one shell could undo everything. So he kept working, even when his body begged for rest. He'd crawl beneath tanks in the middle of the night, lantern flickering, breath fogging the air, checking every joint, as though his life depended on it. In truth, it did. By early March, the coil was tested in its truest sense. A German armoured push struck their flank under cover of fog, a sudden, ruthless attack meant to crush them before they could regroup. The brigade scrambled to respond. Engines sputtered to life across the snow, and in that chaos, Antonov's modified tanks were the first to roll out. The men cheered, some shouting his name, others too busy loading shells to notice the symbolism. As the first shots echoed through the mist, Antonov stood beside his machine and watched. He wasn't on the front line, but in a way, his hands were in every bolt and pipe that went forward. When the first Panzer exploded under a volley of fire, his coil had done its job, not by killing, but by moving, by enabling, by refusing to freeze. He felt it deep inside, a quiet vindication that no medal could equal. After the skirmish, when the smoke cleared and the snow was stained red and black, the men found him sitting on a crate, rubbing his hands together for warmth. Someone handed him a cigarette, and he took it without a word. The glow lit his face for a moment, revealing eyes that looked both alive and terribly tired. "You saved us," one of the tankers said. Antonov shook his head. "No, I saved the engines. You saved yourselves." He looked toward the horizon, where the last trails of smoke curled into the darkening sky, and thought of the men who hadn't lived to see the warmth return. The snow kept falling, indifferent to everything, but for the first time, it didn't win. There's a strange thing about war. It breaks you, but sometimes it lets you build something out of the pieces. Antonov didn't see himself as an inventor or a savior. He was just a man who couldn't stand to see something die when it could still be fixed. Yet his stubbornness had rippled outward, giving men a fighting chance in a world frozen to its core. The irony was bitter and perfect. The smallest piece of copper had done what armies of men couldn't. It kept hope alive. If you're hearing this, and it made you feel something, subscribe. Not for me, but for the ones who built something small that changed everything. Because sometimes history forgets their names, but we don't have to. The storm came down without warning, swallowing the land in a grey wall that erased everything beyond a few hundred meters. Snow whipped sideways, driven by winds that shrieked like artillery. Men wrapped scarves around their faces, shouting orders that vanished into the roar. It was the kind of weather that turned war into madness, where friend and foe dissolved into the same white blur. Yet in that chaos, the 3rd Guards Tank Brigade was already moving. While other Soviet units lay paralyzed by the cold, their engines dead, their crews trapped in steel tombs, Antonov's machines came to life with a low rumble that vibrated through the frozen ground. The exhaust from 50 T-34s cut black scars through the storm. Copper coils hissed and steamed, glowing faintly beneath the armor, invisible to the enemy, but vital as blood to a beating heart. The men inside coughed on diesel fumes and prayed quietly. None of them would ever see Antonov's face that morning. He was somewhere behind them, half buried in snow beside a workshop tent, tightening a leaking line on the last tank to leave. He didn't see the column roll out. He only heard it, the rhythm of engines he had taught to live. Out on the steppe, the Panzers waited. The German 2nd Panzer Division had entrenched itself on high ground overlooking the frozen river bend, confident that no Soviet armor could maneuver through such conditions. Their engines had been running intermittently for days, just enough to keep the oil from solidifying, but even so, several had seized by dawn. Crews worked frantically, heating components with torches, swearing through clenched teeth. Then they heard it, the deep rolling thunder of T-34s emerging from the fog. At first they dismissed it as artillery echoing off the snow, but then the sound grew louder, closer, unmistakable. "Impossible," one commander muttered. "No tank moves in this." He was wrong. The Soviet formation broke through the storm like a wall of steel ghosts. The T-34s charged with lights off, only the flare of their guns marking their advance. Snow blasted off their hulls as the treads bit deep into the crust. Machine gun fire sparked harmlessly against the sloped armor. The first German line opened up, the muzzle flashes lighting the haze like lightning, but by the time the first shells hit, the Soviets were already among them. The T-34s moved with a ferocity the enemy hadn't seen since before the frost. They were faster, meaner, relentless. And at the heart of that surge were Antonov's coils, keeping their fuel alive while the Panzers choked on their own cold breath. Inside one tank, the driver gritted his teeth and shouted over the roar, "Keep it hot! Keep it hot!" The gunner laughed like a madman, the kind of laugh that only comes when fear has burned itself out. They burst through a snowbank and slammed into a Panzer III head-on, the impact shuddering through the steel. Before the German crew could react, the Soviet gun barked, and the world disappeared in fire. Another tank swung left, treads grinding over the wreckage, its hull blackened by the blast. All around, the battle unfolded in flashes of light and silence, each explosion muffled by the snow, each shout swallowed by the storm. It was a vision of hell frozen over, fire and ice locked in a brutal dance. By mid-morning, the fog began to lift, revealing the carnage. Black smoke twisted into the pale sky, and the ground was littered with burning hulks half buried in snowdrifts. The Germans tried to regroup, but their armor faltered. Many of their tanks had frozen during the counterattack attempt, engines refusing to turn. Crews abandoned them, running through waist-deep snow as Soviet shells tore the ridges apart. The T-34s pressed the advantage. They didn't stop. They couldn't. The heat that fed their engines was a fragile gift. If they rested too long, the coils would cool, and the frost would claim them again. So they kept moving, their tracks cutting a black lattice into the white field. Behind the line, Antonov had joined a convoy of mechanics advancing cautiously to recover damaged vehicles. His hands were black with oil, his breath visible even inside the cabin. He listened to the distant artillery like a mechanic listens to an engine. He could tell the rhythm of victory or disaster by the tone. When the sound shifted to steady bursts and the radio crackled with frantic German transmissions, he knew. He smiled, just barely. The coil had held. The tanks hadn't failed. They were outrunning the Panzers. But war has no mercy for its makers. One of the modified tanks took a direct hit near the turret ring, catching fire instantly. The heat melted the coil, rupturing the line. Diesel and fire mixed, turning the crew compartment into an inferno. Antonov arrived minutes later, stumbling through snow and smoke, coughing from the fumes. The wreck hissed and popped, its steel groaning as it cooled. The men inside hadn't made it out. He stood there for a long time, staring at what his invention had saved and what it couldn't. A sergeant came up beside him, face streaked with soot. "They died moving," he said quietly. "Better than freezing." Antonov nodded. The words didn't comfort him. Nothing ever really did. By afternoon, the Germans began to retreat. The battle had turned into a rout. Soviet tanks chased them across the river, treads throwing up fountains of ice and mud. From the air, it looked impossible. T-34s storming through terrain where even trucks couldn't crawl. The radio operators were shouting over each other, reports overlapping, laughter mixing with static. Somewhere in that chaos, a voice said what everyone was thinking. They said it was useless. No one answered, but they all knew who they meant. When the sun dipped low, painting the snow in sickly orange, the battlefield fell silent again. Fires burned weakly across the horizon. The storm had passed, leaving behind a wasteland of twisted steel and frozen corpses. Antonov walked among the wrecks, his boots crunching over shell fragments and ice. Each tank told a story, some burned, some shattered, some still steaming but alive. He knelt beside one of his coils, blackened but intact, and touched it gently. It had survived more than he ever thought it would. Around him, soldiers began clearing the field, hauling ammunition, pulling the wounded from wrecks. Somewhere nearby, a soldier was singing softly under his breath, the words lost to the wind. Antonov closed his eyes. For the first time since the war began, he felt something close to peace. Not pride, not victory, but a quiet certainty that what he'd done had mattered. That night, the brigade gathered around fires made from shattered crates and splintered planks. The air still smelled of fuel and smoke. The men spoke in low voices, replaying the battle in fragments, how their tanks had cut through the snow, how the Germans had panicked, how the coils had held. Someone mentioned Antonov, calling him the man who outsmarted the winter. He didn't join the circle. He sat alone beside a silent engine, cleaning his tools. When a young gunner approached to thank him, Antonov only said, "Thank the tank. I just kept it alive." The boy nodded, not quite understanding, and left him to his thoughts. As the fires burned lower, Antonov looked out across the white plain, now scarred with tracks and wreckage. The storm clouds were clearing, and a few stars shone through. The engines around him ticked softly as they cooled, exhaling like tired animals. He thought of home, of the factory floor he'd left behind, of his mother's voice, of warmth that wasn't borrowed from machinery. He hadn't felt any of it in years. Maybe he never would again. But as the wind shifted and carried the faint scent of oil and victory, he allowed himself a small, weary smile. The coil had done more than keep the fuel warm. It had kept them moving when the world tried to stop them. And in war, that was everything. By dawn, the snow had turned to slush, dark with ash and blood. The storm had broken, but the wind carried a new kind of coldness, the metallic scent of death. Across the horizon, the shattered remnants of the German line lay smoking, their silhouettes barely visible through the mist. The 3rd Guards Tank Brigade had done the impossible. They'd moved, fought, and won, in conditions no one believed survivable. But the price had been steep. Dozens of tanks were crippled, half buried in mud and debris, their tracks twisted, their crews gone. The ground was littered with frozen gloves, broken helmets, and pieces of machines that had once been gods of war. Antonov walked through it all, with the slow gait of a man whose body had forgotten warmth. He carried a spanner in one hand, though there was nothing left to fix. Each step crunched over remnants of victory, and with every sound, the weight on his shoulders grew heavier. He had proven them wrong. The coil worked, but standing there among the wrecks, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like betrayal. He had given life to machines that now stood silent over the men who'd driven them. The colonel found him near a wrecked Panzer, its turret torn open like a peeled can. "You did it," he said, voice rough with admiration. "They'll write your name for this." Antonov didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on a T-34 lying half submerged in the frozen ditch ahead. Steam still rose from its engine, the copper coil glowing faintly as if it refused to die. He knew that tank. He had built that coil himself. Inside were men he'd eaten, laughed with. The colonel followed his gaze, said nothing more, and walked away. Antonov stepped forward, boots sinking into the mix of ice and oil, and reached the hatch. It was jammed. He wiped away the frost with his sleeve and saw the gunner slumped against the wall. His hands blackened, his eyes open, but empty. They hadn't frozen. They'd burned. He closed the hatch quietly, then turned his face to the wind, letting the sting of the snow wash the smell of diesel and death from his skin. By noon, new orders arrived. The Germans were regrouping to the west, preparing a counterattack. Command wanted the 3rd Guards to advance again before the enemy could recover. There would be no rest, no repair, no mourning. The wounded were left behind with blankets and vodka, and the dead were buried beneath thin layers of snow. The living climbed back into their tanks, hollow-eyed, hands trembling from exhaustion and cold. Antonov joined them this time, not as an engineer, but as part of the crew. The commander had insisted, "You should see what you built." He took the radio seat, headset pressed against his ears, the voice of war buzzing inside his skull. When the engines roared back to life, he felt it, the pulse of his creation spreading through the steel like a heartbeat. The column rolled forward into the white. The snow was melting now, turning the ground into sludge. The tanks slid and struggled for traction, their treads grinding through mud that stank of rot. The Germans were waiting on higher ground, hidden behind burned-out farmhouses and mounds of earth. They opened fire the moment the Soviets crested the hill. Shells screamed overhead, exploding in fountains of dirt and flame. The first 2 T-34s were hit immediately, their turrets thrown skyward in showers of sparks. The rest surged forward. Antonov's tank jolted as the driver shouted, "Hold her steady!" The gunner fired back, each recoil shaking the air out of their lungs. Through the periscope, Antonov caught flashes of movement, black crosses on white hulls, the silhouettes of Panzers maneuvering like predators in fog. The radio crackled with overlapping voices, chaos layered on chaos. 3 o'clock! Range 200! Fire! Tracks hit! We're losing pressure! Fuel line burst! Engines hot! Each shout bled into the next until it became one long scream of survival. Antonov adjusted the frequency, trying to cut through the noise, when a sudden impact threw him against the wall. The tank shuddered, the lights flickered, and hot diesel began to hiss somewhere behind him. "We're hit!" the driver yelled. Antonov crawled to the rear, his hands fumbling through the dark, tracing the line. The coil was intact, but a fragment had punctured the fuel line. He grabbed a wrench, heart pounding, and twisted the valve shut. The heat was unbearable. Smoke filled the cabin, and the world outside glowed red. They were surrounded now. "Reverse!" the commander shouted, but the driver's reply came as a gurgle. He was gone. The tank jolted again. Another hit. The periscope cracked. For a moment, everything was just noise and pressure and light. Antonov climbed into the driver's seat, pushing the body aside. He couldn't see much, just smoke and snow and shapes that moved like shadows. He pressed the throttle, and the engine roared. The tank lurched backward, then forward again, breaking through a wall of debris. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he couldn't stop. If he stopped, the cold would claim them, the fuel would gel, and the machine would die. So he kept moving. He drove blind through the chaos, bullets hammering against the armor, the smell of fire thick in the air. When he finally broke through the ridge, he saw it. The German line collapsing, tanks burning, infantry scattering like ants. Soviet reinforcements were arriving from the east, their guns blazing. He stopped the tank on the crest, breath ragged, body trembling. For a few seconds, everything went quiet except for the ticking of the engine and the faint hiss of steam. He realized he was still alive. His hands shook violently. Around him, the other tanks emerged from the smoke, blackened but moving. The battle was over. They had survived again, but the price had been carved into every face. That night, Antonov sat outside his tank, staring at the flames licking the sky. The snow was gone now, replaced by mud streaked with fuel. The men were laughing, drunk on victory and grief, their voices rising over the wind, but he felt nothing. His eyes were fixed on the copper coil glowing faintly under the hull, still warm, still alive. It had done its job. It had kept them moving, but how many lives had it dragged forward only to see them burn? He thought of the first time he'd bent the pipe in his hands, the smell of oil and the hum of hope. He wondered if he'd done the right thing. Maybe some things weren't meant to survive. Maybe death by freezing would have been kinder. He looked toward the horizon, where black smoke blurred into the stars, and whispered to no one, "What have I done?" If you were him, watching something you created save men and kill others, would you call it a victory or a curse? Tell me in the comments. Right, I know what it's like to build something that hurts. When the last shot faded, the world seemed too still to be real. The front had shifted westward, leaving behind a grey wasteland where snow and soot mixed into something unrecognizable. Days passed without orders, without movement. The men wandered among their tanks like ghosts who had forgotten what to do with silence. Even the engines seemed to breathe differently, no longer roaring, only sighing, ticking as the heat drained from them. Antonov lived in that stillness, like a man half awake. His hands twitched at night, searching for tools that weren't there. The others slept in clusters inside their machines, but he built himself a small shelter beside the workshop, a patchwork of metal sheets and torn canvas that clattered in the wind. From there, he could see the whole field, the rows of tanks standing motionless, each one scarred, each one bearing his mark. The coils, once bright, had dulled to soot-black rings. He thought of them the way some men think of children, built with care, unleashed into a world that didn't deserve them. Every morning he walked the line, touching each hull as if to check for a pulse. Some of the crews nodded to him, others avoided his eyes. They all respected, but respect in war is a quiet thing. It hides behind fatigue and superstition. They called him Father Fire now, a name that made him uncomfortable. He didn't want reverence, he wanted forgetfulness, yet the coil had made that impossible. Headquarters had sent a reporter once, a pale young woman from Moscow with a notebook too clean for the mud. She asked him how it felt to change the course of a campaign. He looked at her for a long moment and finally said, "It feels like watching the coal die a little slower." She didn't understand. No one did. The story they printed spoke of ingenuity, courage, Soviet willpower. It didn't mention the smell of burning diesel in men's lungs, or the sound of a tank crew screaming when a line burst under pressure. They made him into a symbol, and symbols don't get to rest. When spring began to chew through the snow, the brigade was ordered south. The ice melted into rivers that swallowed the roads. The tanks moved slowly, treads sinking deep. Every kilometre a struggle against the thaw. For the first time in months, the men complained about heat instead of cold. Antonov should have been pleased. The coil had done its duty, its era ending with the frost. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something essential had been lost with the winter. The cold had been cruel, yes, but it had given him purpose. Now there was only mud and the heavy stink of rot. At night he sat by the water's edge, watching reflections of firelight tremble across the surface, thinking about home. Not about victory or medals, but about the small apartment he had left behind, about the smell of bread, about his mother's hands turning dough into life. He couldn't remember her face anymore. War does that. It steals the ordinary until only the extraordinary remains, and even that feels empty. One evening, a young mechanic approached him, nervous, holding a twisted piece of copper in his hand. "Comrade Antonov," the boy said, "this one cracked during the march. Can you fix it?" Antonov took it, ran his thumb along the split seam, and nodded. He heated the metal over a small fire, hammered it flat, shaped it again with slow, deliberate strokes. The boy watched in silence, the fire painting both their faces orange. When it was done, Antonov handed it back. "It'll hold," he said. The boy thanked him and left. Antonov stared at the glowing embers and thought of how many lives that same motion, bend, seal, tighten, had changed. It was such a simple act, repairing a line, and yet it had become the hinge between life and death for hundreds. He wondered if, after the war, his hands would remember anything else. Rumours came with the warmer winds, talk of a push toward Kharkov again, of the Germans regrouping, of endless offensives that would eat another year of their lives. The men groaned, but there was a kind of grim acceptance in their voices. They had become part of the machinery they served. As long as the tanks moved, they would follow. Antonov didn't argue. He prepared the engines, checked the coils one last time, and said nothing. That night, as the camp settled into uneasy sleep, he lay awake, listening to the thaw. Water dripped from the tank hulls in slow rhythms, like clocks counting down to something inevitable. He realized that even in warmth, the cold lived on inside him. It had carved a place there, something permanent. When dawn came, the first rays of light cut across the camp, turning the mud into a mirror. Antonov stood by his machine, touching the metal as if saying goodbye. "You won," he whispered, not to himself, not even to the war, but to the cold. Then he turned away and walked toward the command tent, ready to face whatever came next. For the first time in months, his breath didn't fog in the air, but the chill never left his bones. By midsummer, the front had crawled west again, swallowing villages whose names no one bothered to remember. The war kept moving, but Antonov stayed the same, hands black with oil, eyes too tired for celebration. Heat shimmered above the plain, where months before the frost had ruled. Fields of wreckage now baked under a sun that seemed almost mocking. Grass had begun to creep through shattered treads. Birds nested inside the holes that shells had made. The living walked past the dead without looking down. That was how survival worked now. You learned to step over ghosts. Antonov spent his days in the repair pits, rebuilding what the last offensive had destroyed. He still carried his coils with him, coiled neatly like snakes inside a box. They weren't needed much anymore, but he couldn't bring himself to throw them away. They were relics of the cold, reminders of the thing he had beaten but could never forget. Sometimes at night he took one out and turned it in his hands, the metal catching firelight, and thought of how such a small shape had once held an army together. The younger mechanics treated him like a legend now. They brought him cigarettes and questions, called him Comrade Engineer, asked about the winter, about the coil, about how it felt to change the tide of battle. He gave them short answers. "It was cold," he said. "We worked." He never told them about the smell of burning fuel, or the way the snow glowed red at dawn. Let them keep the clean version. The truth was too heavy, too quiet. Once, one of the boys said, "You should be proud. Without you, we wouldn't have made it." Antonov looked up from his work and simply said, "Without them, there'd be nothing to fix." The boy didn't know what to make of that, but he stopped talking. Sometimes, in the evenings, Antonov walked beyond the camp to where the ground still bore the scars of winter. The soil was soft, littered with twisted metal, half swallowed by grass. He'd kneel, dig with his hands until he found a piece of copper or steel, wipe it clean, and sit there turning it over, as if he could read the past through touch. In those moments, he felt a strange mix of gratitude and guilt. Gratitude for having made something that lasted, guilt for the lives that didn't. The war had blurred every line between creation and destruction. His invention had saved men only so they could kill more efficiently. Yet even knowing that, he couldn't wish it undone. The coil was honest in a way people weren't. It did exactly what it was built to do. One night, during a lull between assignments, the colonel came to see him. The man looked older, greyer, but his voice still carried that dry authority. "Headquarters wants you back in Moscow," he said. "They're building a new factory there. They need men who can think, not just repair." Antonov didn't answer at first. He watched sparks leap from a nearby welding torch, felt the heat on his face, smelled the metal burning. "You think the war's over?" he asked. The colonel shrugged. "Soon enough. Someone has to plan for what comes next." Antonov thought about it for a long time. He could picture the factory, the smell of oil and iron, the rhythm of machines without the whistle of shells. It should have sounded like peace, but to him, it just felt like another kind of battlefield, one where memory would be the only enemy left. "I'll go when the engines stop," he said finally. The colonel studied him, saw something in his expression that didn't need translation, and left without another. The following weeks blurred together in sun and dust. There were still skirmishes, still repairs, still funerals buried under silence. Antonov began keeping a small notebook. Nothing official, just sketches of coils, notes about fuel flow, the way heat behaved in metal. But between the lines, in handwriting barely legible, he began to write fragments of thought. "We built warmth out of death. Engines remember more than men. When the cold returns, who will be left to fight it?" He didn't know why he wrote these things. Maybe to remind himself that he hadn't turned into one of his machines. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, he sat on the hull of a tank and watched the light slide over its armor. The paint was blistered, the markings almost gone, but it was still whole. A bird landed on the barrel, chirped, and flew away. For the first time in years, he smiled. Not a proud smile, not joy, just a small acknowledgement that life still had the nerve to go on. Around him, The camp settled into a fragile calm. The men were playing cards. Someone was humming an old folk tune, and for a moment, it almost felt like before. Antonov closed his eyes and listened. The engines had gone silent. The world was breathing. Years later, when the war was only a rumor of sound in the back of the mind, Antonov returned to the city that had built him. Moscow looked different, taller, brighter, louder, but to him it smelled the same. Smoke, iron, rain on stone. The trains still coughed black clouds over the rooftop. The factories still hummed through the night. And somewhere inside that noise, he could almost hear the echo of the engines he'd once kept alive. They gave him a small apartment near the plant, a desk in the design bureau, a drawer full of medals he never wore. The coil had become official equipment. Factories stamped them by the thousands, neat and perfect, nothing like the ones he had bent by hand in the snow. Young engineers came to ask for his signature on blueprint, and he gave it without thinking. He was polite, quiet, the old mechanic with the steady hands. Only when the nights were long and the city went still did he feel the truth pressing through the years, that he had never left the front. Not really. The war lived in the rhythm of his pulse, in the smell of oil that clung to his skin no matter how often he washed. He kept one of the original coils on a shelf above his desk, dark with soot, edges worn smooth by touch. People mistook it for a trophy. It wasn't. It was a reminder of what the cold had taken, and what it had given back. Sometimes he'd catch himself staring at it, hearing again the muffled thunder of engines in the snow, the laughter of men who would never come home, the sound of a wrench tightening against frost. He'd close his eyes and for a moment be back there. Kharkov, 40 below, a sky so white it hurt to look at. He could almost feel the metal burn against his glove, hear the captain's voice calling it useless. Then he'd open his eyes and the room would come back into focus, warm and dim, the coil silent and harmless. Time had turned memory into something soft, but not gentle. When peace finally felt real, Antonov retired to a small village south of Tula. He planted a garden, built a shed from scrap iron, and spent his days repairing tools for neighbors who didn't know his story. They called him the quiet old mechanic. He liked it that way. Every autumn, when the first frost came, he'd light a small stove in the corner of his workshop and sit beside it, listening to the crackle of fire and the wind brushing the door. The sound always brought him back to the beginning, to that first night when he rerouted the exhaust through the copper coil and prayed it wouldn't explode. He'd think of the men laughing when the engine, of the smell of heat on frozen metal, and he'd feel something close to peace. Not forgiveness, not pride, just peace. The kind that comes when you finally understand that what you made, for all its cost, kept someone else alive. In the last winter of his life, a historian came to see him. A young man, polite, with a notebook, and the sort of enthusiasm only the untouched can have. He asked questions about innovation, about courage, about the moment of invention. Antonov listened, smiled faintly, and said, "It wasn't courage, it was cold. The cold makes you think faster." The historian laughed, wrote it down, and didn't notice the way the old man's eyes drifted toward the window, where snow had begun to fall. After the visitor left, Antonov sat there a while longer, watching the flakes blur the world outside. He reached up, took the old coil from the shelf, and set it on the table beside his tea. The metal was cool against his fingers. He whispered, almost to himself, "Still running, aren't you?" and smiled. When they found him the next morning, the stove had gone out, but the coil still gleamed faintly in the half-light. They said it was just reflection, nothing more. Maybe they were right, or maybe the metal remembered. If this story stayed with you, if it made you feel that small pulse of heat in the middle of the cold, then keep it alive. Leave a like, subscribe, and carry it forward. Some fires shouldn't go out,